Hi, everyone. This is Jason Barrick of Wall Street for Main Street, and independent financial journalist and managing editor of the News Doctors, Eric Dubin. Welcome back to another Welcome to Dystopia podcast. This is episode number 21. Now, Eric, there's a lot going on in the gold and silver market today. Really, this week, we've had a real major correction. You know, the gold stocks and silver stocks are down. We're getting comments from my friends about it, how their portfolio's down. You've talked in the past on the Metals and Markets report about how Wall Street was waiting for a correction to come in and buy the dips. Do you think that that's going to be happening very soon?
Well, I mean, I don't know to what extent Wall Street's been hanging out waiting to buy dips or whatnot, but, certainly there are the majority of people within the Wall Street community that hate gold, and they're dogpiling on and selling this. And if you look at the open interest as well as the very high level of short interest that has exploded as gold and silver have moved higher, particularly on the COMEX, it's clear that there was basically an operation to try to issue ever more larger batches of futures contracts on a COMEX to soak up this rising demand. And eventually it has caught up with us. The momentum and markets don't, trees don't grow to the sky, markets don't go up forever. Momentum is fading, and commitment with all of these dynamics, we have simultaneously seen this veritable fiesta of jawboning from Federal Reserve Board of Governors and other folk that are not necessarily members who are going to be voting in the next policy setting FOMC meetings, basically trying to paint the picture that the U.S. economy is in better shape than what the economic stats that have been in an endless parade of negative stats, with the exception of what we're seeing periodically in the job numbers. And then recently, ever since this shift in Federal Reserve spin, for lack of a better way of putting it, we've also seen economic numbers coming out that are somewhat fishy, like today's housing surprise, where they're talking about a very large number of houses having been sold and so forth. So frankly, I think what's going on in part is that the dollar was falling apart at a rate that was accelerating to the downside. We sliced through 92 on the DXY dollar index, which is a basket of 6 currencies, main currencies that the dollar trades against. Although that's changing, but that's a subject for another day. But the reality is that when markets begin to move as quickly as they were in the currency markets, I think it was giving a lot of concern to the policymakers. And we have had this kind of a quasi wink and nod agreement with China, and informal coordination going on with the Treasury and the powers that be in China to try to effectuate the yuan declining in value vis-a-vis the Japanese yen and the euro, but not against the dollar, because back in August of 2015 and as well earlier this year, when the Chinese yuan took a really big devaluation at a very fast clip vis-a-vis the dollar, the U.S. stock market rolled over, and we had corrections in excess of 10%. And all of these markets are interlinked, and this whole artificial construct that we've had in the credit markets in particular, with this, ever since 2008, with the never-ending QE programs and other forms of credit, the system is very, very unstable. And the currency wars are one of the very last means by which economies and the policymakers trying to eke out growth. It's one of the very last means by which they can actually get some traction. So China, in particular, is kind of behind the 8 ball, and they definitely want to see the yuan devalued by at least another 20%. This is their formal policy. And when the Federal Reserve honchos came out and the FOMC meeting minutes from April were announced last week, the markets have been in turmoil ever since, and that has corresponded exactly with the beginning of May, and that dip below 92 on the DXY index. And forgive me for rambling on, but all of these intermoving parts are related, and I think the general theme is one where certainly the Western central bankers, the Draghis and Yellens of the world and the treasuries and ECBs and so forth, Bundesbank, et cetera, they're all interested in trying to paint this picture of a global economy finally getting ready to start reflating. It's like if they pretend enough and issue enough statements about how the economies are, around Europe and the United States are getting better, that they hope to, in fact, see some shift in psychology. They're literally trying to paint the tape in a way to make people believe that an inflationary cycle is just around the corner. I mean, if you read the Bloomberg articles or Reuters articles coming off of the wire today, that's the kind of commentary that you're seeing out of the main analysts and major Wall Street banks trying to scratch their head and figure out what the heck the central bankers are doing. So gold is kind of licking at support right now, roughly. I mean, we have now closed, and I'll get myself a quote at some point during the course of our conversation here, but the bottom line is that it is trying to bounce off of that 1,220, 25 area of general support. And we'll see what happens, but the downside momentum has been pretty significant in the last couple of days, ever since the FOMC meetings, surprise. And it's going to be interesting to see whether we hold tomorrow, because tomorrow is going to be really an important day when it comes to gold in that $1,220 threshold level. Silver's already fallen apart. That's like an anchor pulling gold down. Mining shares took big hit. And then, the sentiment for Wall Street was, maybe 5 to 10% of the traders were expecting that we'd have the next interest rate normalization hike, so to speak, by July of this year. And at this point, it's flipped all the way to 50% of traders assuming that. And then those are based on the implied probabilities that you can see within the futures markets when it comes to the Fed funds rate. So there's been a huge shift in psychology, but frankly, I think it's all a bunch of nonsense. We are not seeing a acceleration of the global economy, and anyone who thinks we are seeing that is smoking some interesting opium.
Yeah, let me add some things from the real economy here in the United States. We have Target, we have Kohl's, we have Macy's, all report awful retail revenues and earnings. Just totally awful. Way too much inventory. They believe that the economy is recovering, so they started building inventory again, and now they can't sell it. Yeah. We have Sports Authority, which is one of the largest retail sporting goods stores in the nation, closing all of its stores in the next month or so. I think they're having a big going out of business sale, guys. If there's a sporting goods store around you and you're planning on getting some gear for sports, or maybe like some bow and arrow for prepping or something like that, or some tasers or something for prepping and stuff, maybe now's the time if that's on sale. And then we have Wendy's, which based on, the California announcing that they're planning on increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and other states are rumbling about it too. Wendy's is also planning on adding 6,000 touch screens to their stores, and that's going to lower a lot of jobs. These things in unison, Eric, they don't spell that the economy is going to be adding a lot of jobs. I also, with the oil and gas recovery, it's temporary. The oil and gas is going back down, so I don't see a lot of oil and gas jobs being created like what we had during the shale boom. So I just don't see the job growth there talking about this recovery.
Well, it definitely is a very weak economy, and we have economic policy that is driven largely on propaganda. The management of perspective economics and psychology are the cornerstones of economic policy in the West, and that is really truly a travesty. And that's where we are, in part because of just the financialization of our economy and the growth of malinvestments. Sound money is important, which is an interesting subject in and of itself, given how frequently in the last month mainstream media has actually been somewhat positive when it comes to talking about the gold standard and giving some attention to it. It's still denigrated, of course, but that's how advanced the entropy within our financial system has become. We're now seeing, the mainstream even talk about the gold standard, and That's pretty surprising. It just goes to show how much damage has been done with really truly asinine economic policies.
Eric, did you also see in the last couple of days that Hillary Clinton was talking about that Trump is pretend successful, and that she was talking about how Trump will bankrupt the United States if he's the president? I was laughing at that because I was like, aren't we already bankrupt in printing money?
And the two of them are going to definitely start upping the ante in their war. I mean, Trump is now talking about the stuff that Roger Stone has been unearthing and documenting in his latest book when it comes to, Bill Clinton, basically having raped over 20 people. And now,
Yeah, we should get Roger Stone on to talk about that. That would be some interesting stuff.
Yeah, and, so Trump is now using that material as a foil and beating Hillary over the head with it, and then Hillary is,
he made a short video. He released a short video, didn't he? And then the mainstream media is responding. They're coming up with these. Roger Stone, I think, predicted this too. He said if Trump took the lead in the nomination and was starting to lead in the national polls for the president over the Democratic candidate, that the mainstream media would start to trot out these stories that Donald Trump, was using the mafia to gain like an advantage in the real estate community in the New York City in the 70s and 80s and stuff.
Yeah.
But I spoke with some real estate investors, who I'm good friends with, and they were telling me, look, basically to get any business done back then, you had to, deal with the mafia because they were that connected with the Teamsters and unions and stuff like that. So, I mean, Trump is just a good businessman. He figured out ways around it. He's already admitted in the past to having to hire lobbyists just to deal with the regulations and things like that. So, I mean, he's not, let's see here, he's not the full moral libertarian that's not going to deal with, corrupt crony capitalists and stuff like that. He's a good businessman. So
he's like an archetype of a crony capitalist, but Hillary is crony capitalist combined with being a psychopath.
well, Hillary is not even a capitalist, right? Has she even built a successful business? She's just a crony, right? She's just a parasitical crony, right, who's made money off of crony capitalists who's gotten donations from them. She's never built a real business before, I don't think. At least Trump has built, some nice buildings and things like that that are at least somewhat useful. But you brought up an interesting point there, Eric, about the dollar index for our listeners. I actually wrote an article about this after the 2008 crash, talking about the problems with the dollar index and how misleading it was. You mentioned there's 6 currencies in the basket of the dollar index. The 2 main ones are the Japanese yen and the euro.
Right.
So, I mean, you're not getting an accurate value of how the dollar is doing against all the currencies of the world. And global trade is not just the euro and the yen anymore and the dollar. Now you have the Chinese RMB. You have so many other economies. The BRICS and the developing world are now, I think, they're over 50% now of the global economy, right, Eric? They've grown so much in the last decade or two.
Right. And even on a trade-weighted basis, the dollar vis-a-vis, when we speak of trade weighting, and that's an actual index that's maintained, Bloomberg does one, and there are other groups that maintain it. Even the dollar vis-a-vis most of our trading partners is stronger. So it's really interesting to see that, the Fed is stuck. They are trying to do interest rate normalization, and part of the reason why they want to do that is to try to repair the Treasury market too. Because here we talked about this a bit off the air before we started, recording today. That the Chinese have sold over somewhere in the neighborhood of about $1 trillion worth of Treasuries in the last 18 months, and they buy more too as well. So it's a flow kind of thing. They sell and they buy on an ongoing basis, depending on what month you may be looking at. But on a net basis, they've sold, in the last 18 months, something like $2 trillion worth of treasuries, and the ongoing challenge of financing the United States government is also in the back of the mind of people in policy circles, and when we're living in this ZERP world, all of this stuff just gets incredibly complicated. The ability for the Bank of England and the ECB and the Bank of Japan and the Fed to coordinate these kind of currency machinations that are driving economic policy, because that's really a big part of what, in fact, is shaping economic policy, is very difficult to do. And when China devalued the yuan after the Fed had released those minutes, that just goes to show, with prima facie evidence, that the level of coordination between all of these various central bankers is not as tight as people expect and believe. So it's very dangerous. I believe we're going to see a lot of extreme volatility in the summer. So buckle up. And this whole correction with gold, and in it large part being driven by the dollar's rise, is short term. I can't imagine how the policymakers would want a U.S. DXY index as but one representation of a strong dollar being anywhere above, say, for example, 97 for the point of illustration on that index. But at this stage, it looks like that's where that's where the market makers and popular sentiment, the momentum chasers, want to see it, and they're putting their bets down, and that's where the forex market is going. But I'm truly surprised. I thought that we would not get over 95 earlier on, and then the Fed minutes came out, because there's been a shift in the policymakers' objectives. They want to try to get the dollar a little bit more stable and smack somewhere 95 to 97 trading range on DXY, because that serves the ability of the Treasury to further sell bonds.
And the currency markets, Eric, are one of the most manipulated markets on planet Earth. I think it's a couple $1 trillion worth of currencies are traded a day. So there's a lot of room there with that liquidity for central bankers all over the world to go in there and manipulate markets.
It's the biggest trading market in the world on a daily basis. The last figure I saw, $5.3 trillion on an average basis day. A lot of money.
Yep. And now I'm looking at the Junior Gold Miners ETF, or GDXJ, and I'm looking at the 2-year chart right now. And, obviously I think it looks like a very strong bottom in late January of 2016. We put in, a cup with a handle, and then we just took off, and almost, almost a parabolic basically line up. So we were overdue for a correction. We were over 100% gains on the GDXJ since December at one point. So that's an incredible market. Like I said, normally markets don't go straight up, and for the people who did have over 100% gains, there was some people who took some profits. So there's going to be, whenever you have 100% gains in only 4 or 5 months, people are going to take profits off those things. They're not going to ride them up because if you're a money manager, Eric, or a hedge fund, you need to show that you booked profits for the quarter and stuff like that, so you can use it for your marketing purposes and attract more investors. So you need to show that, I was profitable this quarter, next quarter, quarter after, and also for the year, blah, 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 blah. So they're not going to let everything ride, and either they moved up their stops all along the way, and then they got stopped out and they took out their gains, and maybe they're going to wait for a little bit more of a correction, then they're going to buy back in. But I think we are going to see the money managers look for the best gold stocks. We are going to see that. I also think, Eric, we've seen Goldcorp do an acquisition too added to that. I think there's a lot of mid-tier miners on the prowl for acquisitions, ones that haven't done them yet. I heard from some of my contacts that the larger senior miners are looking to fund juniors for exploration again, so to do private placements and start to drill the ground again. Obviously, that's not necessarily going to be spending lots of money to actually build mass amounts of new mines. I don't think we're at a gold or silver price, Eric, where we're going to start seeing massive new amounts of gold and silver mines built anytime soon. We'd have to see, gold probably definitely over 1,300 stay there, maybe even over 1,350 or 1,400 have to stay there for a while, and silver, over $20, $22 have to stay there for a while before we start seeing, good amount of new gold and silver mines being built.
Well, you also have the production line too as well, because juniors haven't been doing as much exploration in the last 5 years vis-a-vis the previous 5 years before that. So even if everything was perfect instantly and you could press a button tomorrow and things start getting normalized, the deposits haven't been found. The pipeline isn't there. So this whole bull market has got legs like nobody's business. It's going to be a long duration bull market in the precious metals, in part because of the fact that there's been not as much exploration going on.
Yeah, and if they started, permitting and construction of a mine today, it would still take a couple years minimum, depending on the size of the mine, for it to get built. If it's a couple 100,000 an ounce a year gold mine, it's going to take more than 2 or 3 years to get built. If it's over 500,000 an ounce a year gold mine, it's going to take 5 years, 7 years. So there's long lead times depending upon the country and the capital cost, the capex of the mine to get built, and things like that, and how much infrastructure is already in place. So there's not going to be a lot of immediate gold supply at those higher prices hitting. Maybe some of the miners will start, when silver was at 18, maybe they would start adding a little bit more of the marginal grade ore back into the mill. But, you know, it's not going to be whole new mines being added. We're not at those prices where entirely massive amounts of new mines are going to be added. But if the correction does continue, Eric, and I've talked about this in past podcasts, last couple of them, you know, if we see gold maybe break 1,200, silver maybe get back down to 15 or below, those are going to be prices where the larger royalty and streaming companies, the Franco-Nevadas, the Silver Wheatons, the Royal Golds, the Sandstorm Golds, and also the Osisko royalties, those are basically the big five or so. Those guys, they did a large round of deals in 2015. They did over $4 billion worth of deals, and they've been using cash flow to pay off that debt that they did those deals. They're going to be looking for another round of deals since their share prices have gone up to maybe issue equity and do some more deals. So we may see another large round of accretive cash flow deals in that space if we do see a continued major correction, because those guys have higher share prices now than they did in 2015. Now, I want to transition now, Eric, to talk about George Soros, Carl Icahn, Stanley Druckenmiller. Do you think these guys, basically, although Carl Icahn doesn't have gold exposure to my knowledge, but basically all these guys sound like they're heavily shorting the stock market, and yet the stock market won't crash. Do you think these guys, you know, they're just looking at earnings, or do you think some of our listeners are saying basically they have inside information, you know, from their crony contacts or lobbyists on either Wall Street or in, you know, government agencies or things like that, and they're thinking that things are going to get a lot worse before the election?
Well, I mean, I don't think that it's necessarily something that they're having the ability to understand from insider information, because the same things that they're looking at are the same kind of things that you and I are aware of too. And it's just being willing to think outside of the box, so to speak, you know, thinking in terms of unconventionally. And these guys have made their fortunes by being unconventional, by being contrarians. Well, Soros has also got that element of being a crony capitalist and trading on inside information as well, too, in a manner of sorts, just because he's so connected. I mean, that I don't mean to completely, you know, dismiss that as being part of the reason why these guys are so successful, particularly Soros. But the reality is that, you know, corporate profits have been rolling over since 2014. The economy has rolled over by all official government statistics, with the exception of stuff that's beginning to percolate out now because of, frankly, in my opinion, and though I can't approve it, desire to spread propaganda about things. You know, that whole housing number. Housing and the unemployment statistics are probably some of the most manipulated out there. So maybe
Eric, in a couple years, we'll get a whistleblower like what happened after Obama's first reelection that came out, you know, from the Department of Labor, and then he spilled it all to the New York Post, talking about how he was all the pressure was put on him and the other Department of Labor workers to make the jobs numbers look good so Obama could get easily reelected. So maybe we'll get that, you know, in a couple years.
Think about this. I was reflecting on that exact same question earlier today in the context of, you know, all these high-powered financial guys coming out and announcing to the world that they're more bearish about general equities than basically in a decade-plus period of time. I mean, Soros is comparing where things are now to having the potential to create a 2008 kind of crash or worse. And all of a sudden, this level of market commentary from people who are highly respected has been flooding into our consciousness in the last month or so. And then all of a sudden, at the same time, we have the Fed and the jawboning talking heads fiesta attempting to counter that. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that they're not directly linked in the sense that, you know, somebody in you know, Yellen's inner circle recognizes all these talking heads and whatnot. It's more of just a reflection on the fact that the market is shifting. And more people are waking up to the realization that the economy worldwide and the United States has rolled over, and corporate profits suck, and that, you know, we've had over $1 trillion of stock buybacks financed by cheap credit to elevate the stock market, and that in fact is the primary reason why the S&P 500 hasn't rolled over while corporate profits have been rolling over. The entire picture that we look at is one of just management around the edges and at the core. Everything that is going on in our financial world is partially an illusion or an outright illusion, depending on what asset you're looking at or what market class.
Yeah, I know Carl Icahn is short, I think 150% of all his capital. He's net short like 150%. It's a record amount. I don't think he's ever been this short.
It's astounding.
I don't think, was he even this short prior to 2008, or did he miss that?
No, he came in late. He didn't totally miss it, but I mean, what's going on now is the awakening of the conventional finance world, and it's still a very small percentage of people who are awake, but as the summer unfolds, we're going to see a lot more of that, and the Fed may pull off one raise, because they may in fact be forced to do that just because these distortions within the credit markets making it really difficult to sell treasuries being one of the untold reasons why they're doing what they're doing. And they may, in fact, be forced to do what they're talking about doing in terms of raising rates by July or wherever. But if they do that, it's going to probably take 15% out of the stock market. And
well, it'll be really interesting, Eric, to see if they let the stock market crash before the November elections or if they let it go after the November elections. Because, in past election cycles, normally the Fed tries to not get involved and let the market crash before the elections, and they kind of let it go after. Now, obviously, I think as Obama was getting elected, I think they did let the market go while George W. Bush was still in office. But I think that was the exception to the rule. Normally in the past, the Fed seems to have, stimulated through the election, and then after the election, they stop it. That's normally in past election cycles what the Federal Reserve has done. Now, I want to talk now about the Deutsche Bank mess. I had Bill Holter on a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about the class action lawsuit that Jim Sinclair is filing. He was talking about how the gold and silver mining companies are going to be joining that. Right. Finally, good news. Although I think, private investors aren't allowed to join it yet. He said they're going to join later. But at least, the gold and silver miners are finally going to be at least joining the lawsuit. Obviously, the American legal system is not efficient. I was in law school for a semester. It's very slow and inefficient. So it's going to take, a long time, probably at least a year or two for some type of settlement or something after these miners file suit. And then it could go to appeals, et cetera, et cetera. Although, Deutsche Bank has obviously, admitted guilt, and now they have to turn over the records. But, with the discovery process, all these emails and communications and stuff, I mean, this is going to take minimum 6 months to a year before we start to get a lot of information coming out of these emails and stuff.
It's even been going on for more than a year already. I mean, the story broke recently, but this has been an ongoing process. So,
do you think they were negotiating like some kind of deal or something behind the scenes to avoid guilt and just pay a fine or something, and that they had already started turning over the evidence for discovery?
I don't think they turned over all the evidence, but they certainly have been. The investigation has been ongoing for over a year. So I know that the fact that they have now come to a settlement is a clear indication that, in the very least, we can conclude that Deutsche Bank's attorneys and the strategists trying to wrap their brain around what the heck is going to happen in the aftermath, they realized that they had to settle. Getting in front of the problem and recognizing that the problem is something that couldn't sweep under the rug is the take-home point.
Did you hear the rumors that they were pressured into settling by the German government, and that Deutsche Bank is going to be split up into they're going to take the worst of the assets and put them in a really bad sinkhole bank, and it's going to be fully nationalized in the near future, and then they're going to take the less bad assets, and that's going to be the new Deutsche Bank?
Yeah, maybe they were that's what you and I were talking about earlier this week in a couple of instant messages back and forth, and I think that's where we're going. The most likely scenario for Deutsche Bank is one where they split it into two banks or more, and that the lousy assets are flushed down the toilet and nationalized, that there will be a giant bailout on the back of the German taxpayer. And
So
I should also say as well, too, there's quite a bit of speculation going on right now in the alternative asset community that Deutsche Bank is going to serve as the black swan catalyst that's going to bring everything down. And that's not likely. This is, by definition, a black swan is one where the event happens completely out of the blue, and we've been talking about Deutsche Bank for over a year now. I mean, this is very well understood. The regulators are all over the situation, and it is possible for Deutsche Bank to implode and serve as the kindling by which the entire financial system would just go up in flames with some derivative counterparty domino cascade kind of thing going off. I mean, that definitely is there. The kindling is there. But the regulators and the, powers that be, particularly in Germany, but, this is a multi-court full press from people in the United States and whatnot as well. Fed's going to be willing to probably help out too with swap lines and things like that, but they're going to bring Deutsche Bank down and corral the mess. And I was looking at the stocks chart actually, and you can't make a huge amount of information from this, but it is interesting to see that we have slight higher lows in the last 6 months or so in Deutsche Bank, even though it looks like a complete disaster right now, literally as we record. And this week in general, in relation to what we were speaking about before, about this whole jawboning fiesta with this unprecedented number of Federal Reserve people coming out and talking about how they're going to be able to successfully reflate, and have interest rate normalization. And the banks today, the financial sector, the bank stocks did supremely well, and the whole propaganda meme coming out of the financial press and the mainstream today is one where, negative interest rates are bad for the spreads that power bank profits, and that this whole talk of, similar to what I was describing in terms of making bonds easier to sell, the whole thesis of the economy is going to be doing much better because the Fed is talking about being able to raise rates, and therefore this circular logic proves that the economy is doing better, and that, therefore banks are going to be more profitable, and viola, the bank shares are going up today. And this is happening in part because there's a desire amongst powers that be, amongst the Treasury and the Bundesbank, to try to paint the picture that the financial sector is not going to roll over and croak.
Yeah, the Keynesian circle jerk.
Quite the clusterfuck, my friend. I mean, Deutsche Bank is walking dead right now. And everyone in Germany in the regulatory establishment understands this. They know that Deutsche Bank is, not long for the world, and at some point they're going to have to flush it. And that I don't believe is actually going to necessarily cause the system to go down, because the problem is actually pretty well understood, and they're going to corral it. To draw the analogy, it will be like Bear Stearns in February of 2008. The vultures will circle. They'll nominate some kind of a, to bailout price for, when J.P. Morgan bought Bear Stearns, initially they were offering $2 and change for the stock. Over the weekend, if memory serves, the Treasury Department, took Jamie Dimon aside and said, come on, you got to offer more. I think the company was ultimately sold for $10 or something a share. So maybe Deutsche Bank will go for, I don't know, $7 for the good assets, and then the rest are just nationalized one way or another. Who knows? But the point being that it is kindling that could blow the system. There's no doubt about that. So a lot of the folk that are talking about Deutsche Bank as being that kind of a problem and risk factor certainly are on target with respect to that. But I think that, on our ever quest to be aware of what potentially could be black swans on the not too distant horizon, I don't think Deutsche Bank is going to actually be the black swan that sets in motion things that ultimately could take Deutsche Bank down. It's going to come from something else.
Eric, and I think the larger investment banks on Wall Street collectively decided to try to manipulate base metals and also oil, so it would have a rally, so they wouldn't have to default immediately on a lot of the producers and miners of those commodities, so they could sell more shares and get out of their debt positions and transfer that onto the new equity holders that just sold shares. So I think they bought themselves some time with that.
And trying to prove things like that is always really difficult. But I agree. I think that there is an element to the trading going on in the last month that suggests that one way or another that was partly what was going on. I mean, even you can look at what's going on in Niger with these whole new Avengers group. I forget the name that they're calling themselves. These, latest batch of militant rebels.
Are they actually dressing up in Marvel superhero costumes and putting like YouTube videos up or something? Or
well, they got their own website that they checked out at GoDaddy. I mean, hey.
Oh my God.
But these guys come out of nowhere for the most part, and as a consequence of their actions, 500 million barrels per day worth of petroleum are not on the market, and that had an even bigger impact than the fires in Canada, and that's part of why oil has been able to reflate.
Yeah, so we have had a big rally in the since November, December in oil stocks. I think it's gotten ahead of itself for the most part, guys. I think there's going to be more bankruptcies coming. There's a number of articles on Zero Hedge, and also in the mainstream media you can read about the oil companies that still have massive amounts of debt. There are a lot of oil companies, though, that are selling when the oil price did recover. They hedged out a lot of oil so they could either eke out a little profit or about break even, buy themselves more time. But it's really, you got to be careful with oil companies about what are their costs to produce the oil and how much debt do they have and when is it due. So if you're going to, I wouldn't buy any oil stocks right now at these prices. I would wait for more of a pullback because the rally has gotten a bit ahead of itself. But I think oil did probably bottom, towards the end of 2015, early 2016. I have the oil services ETF if you're looking for investment opportunities, the OIH, and it did look like it put in on the 2-year chart a pretty strong double bottom and then started to bounce up off of it. But I think, the rally got a little bit ahead of itself because we're at an oil price now where a lot of the oil producers still can't make much money. Speaking of which, stuff going on in Brazil and also PetroBras. Have you heard the rumors, Eric? Now there's a lot of Brazilian citizens that are just angry at the whole process. The president of Brazil is being impeached. The corruption, crony capitalism in Brazil. The Olympics is coming up soon. Have you heard the rumors going around the internet? I actually saw a video from a citizen of Brazil. He was alleging, I think Jeff Berwick, not Jeff Berwick, Luke Rindowski from We Are Change, did the interview, the guy in front of the PetroBras building in Rio de Janeiro is a libertarian in Brazil. I think he actually said that it was a CIA operation that collapsed Brazil and that is basically a coup d'etat to put in, more of a U.S.-controlled puppet, and also that, the plan is for the U.S. Oil companies to get more investments into cheap Brazilian oil assets for cheap now, as Petrobras, he said Petrobras, the guy in the interview actually said Petrobras is already bankrupt, but they've been hiding that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens if the U.S. oil companies and China comes in and tries to, take the Brazilian Petrobras oil assets.
Well, I haven't seen that interview, so I can't really comment on that. But there definitely is an element of colored revolution technology being deployed such that, the whole Lula and his party and the scandals that began to percolate with his involvement carrying over to the latest president, all of that is real. However, the guy that is now the interim president was more deeply involved in the car wash scandal, and it's kind of there's a decent amount of indication that he in part launched an effort to wash his hands of his involvement with the car wash scandal by going after the current president and the impeachment process. And the CIA and elements within the deep state do in fact support national corporate interests, and American companies do interface with the State Department and the intelligence services, and they do coordination when it comes to their strategic planning and that whole the NSA revelations that Snowden has revealed.
I was about to bring that up. Yeah, Snowden revealed, right, that the NSA has been spying on behalf of U.S. interests, right, on Petrobras and Brazilian politicians for oil advantages, right?
Right.
For bidding on Brazilian oil assets and other stuff. Yeah.
I mean, it's a multi-faceted kind of dynamic going on here, because you do have organic corruption in this more, socialist-leaning, workers-oriented party, the Reformist Party, and they came in about a decade ago successfully because of the corruption that was in the country earlier, and it's like this kind of cycle that goes back and forth. You get reformist elements, and then the reformist elements get corrupted, and then that ends up creating an opportunity for colored revolution technologies to be employed by Western powers to stir things up locally. And that's not to take away from the organic, real libertarian upwelling that's happening in Latin America, particularly in Venezuela and in Brazil and to some extent in Argentina and places. But
yeah, there's all the leaders in Brazil, Eric, are so corrupt. Like the Libertarian who was giving an interview to Luke Romdowski in Brazil, he was actually saying that the current president of Brazil is being impeached, that a lot of the Brazilians on the ground know that she murdered a policeman in a demonstration in the 70s and 80s. It was common knowledge that her and a group of, Marxist radicals murdered a couple of cops. And, it was just swept under the rug because, she was this strong, smart she was this strong, smart politician type that was electable by the people. So, they skipped over that part. I guess her control file would have been good because they could have used that against her at any time. And, she was brought into political leadership.
Yeah. And it's going to be fascinating to watch because what you were speculating as far as, PetroBras being the prize that Western interests and Chinese interests are after, I think that's definitely true. I think it is the prize. I think it is the prize long term. Think about it. Okay, when the oil prices were high, right, they knew the cost to produce that oil were astronomically high, right? They were going to be at least $65 a barrel. Probably that was the projected cost of the subsalt sands underneath the ocean floor. And, it's ended up being a lot more than that for the cost. And so PetroBras took on over $100 billion worth of debt. And I think at one point, they had like over 100-year bonds they were loaded with because they didn't want to sell shares. So they just loaded on more debt and more debt. And, if the oil price dropped, they knew the company could go bankrupt. PetroBras has a long history of screwing over shareholders and going bankrupt. I didn't know this, but I spoke to a friend of mine who married a Brazilian woman, and he was talking to me about the history of PetroBras. So, yeah, I think the long-term play was when oil was high to trap PetroBras, load on a bunch of debt for it because it was cheaper at the time, trick the executives, and now say, look, PetroBras is bankrupt. We have to come in here and, buy the assets up for a penny. So I think that's what's going to probably happen. Obviously, you brought up Venezuela. The U.S. attempted to do that with U.S. oil companies, and then Chavez came in and kicked it out. Now I want to transition and talk about Venezuela, Eric, the hyperinflation and the collapse. It's just unbelievable. We're seeing the stories of the cost people are paying, with basically backpacks full of Venezuelan bolivars, and also the amount of money everything costs that people take for granted. There's shortages of electricity, toilet paper, baby food, you pretty much name it. And they're even, murdering people all the time in Caracas for even little things to survive. And I think they're eating dogs and cats. It's just unbelievable, total society, total socialist collapse. And it's going to get worse. There's no solution on the horizon at all.
Well, my thoughts and prayers go out to the people in Venezuela, especially the people who did not vote for the socialist government. So I do have compassion for the people maybe that did, that were tricked into it. Maybe they didn't have the education. But, if you were a crony capitalist, if you were friends with Chavez or Maduro and you were rich there and you thought, you could skirt the tax laws and then they screwed you too and took your assets or whatever, then you got what you deserved. If you voted for those guys and expected to be able, to be one of their crony capitalist buddies and not get screwed over and all that. It's just a disaster there. I'm really... I was listening to, did you listen to that Chris Martinson interview where he interviewed Furfall? And he said basically the people there who have nothing, they should just walk out of the country and go to another country if they can, to family or friends, and, just start over. It's really unbelievable. We're in, the 21st century and something like that is already happening.
And with a country that has huge natural resources. Venezuela is a very rich country.
Very true. Very true. They used to be the richest country in Latin America. They had, enormous amount of oil. They have a lot of mining assets, too. They have a lot of gold and copper and stuff like that. Chavez won't allow any exploration. I think there was a Canadian mining company in there that had a profitable gold and copper deposit, and Chavez shut it down and tried to take everything. And, the mining company sued them in court. And that was the only one that had invested in a long time there. But, there's a lot of possibility there for them to turn into maybe Colombia then, to transition to more of a pro-capitalism country. Hopefully the next regime is not connected to Chavez or Maduro. And, you know, they lower the taxes, they bring in capital. They really got to increase the educational system in there. There has to be investment in infrastructure and stuff like that. And the education has to go up so the workers can get skilled. And, you know, there has to be infrastructure so people invest.
And it would be wonderful to see a new version of a third way, so to speak. They used to talk about third way with import substitution and all these other ways of organizing societies in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And maybe libertarianism will take hold. I mean, that would be a really neat thing to see. You know, more of an Austrian school of economics informing public policy when it comes to economics and libertarian principles overall. I mean, it's going to be a long shot, but there are definitely a lot of people that are waking up in Latin America, and Venezuela is one of the epicenters. So, you know.
Well, we are starting to see reform in countries like Argentina after, you know, they've had a number of hyperinflations and corruption. And I think the current president of Argentina fired over 100,000 government workers that really weren't helping the economy out. So, I mean, they are starting to, looks like, to right the ship. But, yeah, Latin America has had a lot of problems with communism and socialism. And, you know, they called it colonialism. But, you know, they have to increase the education in those countries. They have to get the infrastructure investments in there. And, you know, the systems that they've had in the past, none of them just were working. So they have to come up with something else. I think the solution is to where a lot of these mining companies now in Africa and Asia and also South America, you know, when they build a mine, they spend money now on putting nice schools in and infrastructure and electricity and things like that. Maybe that definitely wasn't always the way in the past, but, you know, now that's how a lot of the mining companies do business in developing countries. And, you know, it makes the community feel good, and it brings jobs, and people, the miners and other people who have higher paying jobs, they go and, you know, shop at the stores and eat at the restaurants and stuff and drink beers at the tavern. So, I mean, this is how you start building an economy, and then as you increase, you know, the capital and the education in the economy, then they could develop more highly skilled jobs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Eric, I want to get to the scumbag nominees part of our show. Then we're still under an hour, so fingers crossed. Okay,
people
so these...
Go ahead.
Huh?
Sorry.
Okay, so we have a former Flint official. This is a whistleblower. This is on against cronycapitalism.com. A lot of good scumbag nominees on there, crony capitalists, corrupt politicians, etc. Really like that website. We've had Nick Sorrentino on in interviews in the past. Former Flint official says mayor funneled lead water crisis donations to her political action committee. This is from May 10th, 2016. So you have a former Flint, Michigan city administrator alleging Mayor Karen Weaver funneled funding that was meant to help fix that city's lead water crisis to her political action committee instead. There's no amount of dollar numbers, I think, yet on it, but, you know, that's just unbelievably shameful and corrupt. And
very illegal and easily demonstratable as such. So I have a feeling somebody's going to be seeing some repercussions from that decision.
Well, this is what happens when you vote Democrat and you say, oh, we can have more regulators, there's more government employees.
It's not a Democrat thing. You know, the Republicans are also, you know, equally guilty.
The Republicans tend to, I would say, not want as much government employees, want fixing everything. They tend to be more skeptical of government, although I don't like the Republicans either because they're neocon and tend to want more wars. But yeah, I would say the Democrats, though, they tend to think that the government regulators are, you know, selfless and hardworking, and they do this great job. Well, look, Flint, Michigan had a water crisis, and they had probably very highly paid government water regulators, and they still couldn't have fresh water. So, I mean, the private sector could have fixed this problem very quick. Let's just say government doesn't fix the amount of problems that a lot of the Democrats who always vote Democrat think. But we'll just agree to disagree on that one.
No, we're not necessarily disagreeing, frankly. I mean, the Republicans tend to, as a general rule, be a little bit less favorable of government solutions for everything, and they have a little bit less, you know, of an orientation towards big government being the solution. But the reality is that when it comes down to actual policies and the administrative state and its abuses and the excesses of big government, the Republicans don't get a free pass. I mean, they're definitely the lesser of two evils.
Well, I don't really like either party at this point. Yeah, I mean, the Republicans want to go into your bedroom and tell you can't do this and this and this, and then their foreign policy stuff is just ridiculous at this point.
But they're also
although the Democrats
look. Let's use real examples. Obamacare was one of the largest changes to the economy in the last 10 years, and it's dealing with 1/6 of GDP. And Republicans made a huge amount of noise about, we need to be in favor of small government, so we need to reform Obamacare, we need to kill Obamacare, we need to whatever. In 2014, we had over 50 votes in the House of Representatives that were all just for political show, attempting to deal with Obamacare from the Republicans when the Republicans controlled the House. But they did all of those votes because they knew that they didn't control the Senate, and it was able to be a dog and pony show that they didn't have to, for the purpose of consumption for their domestic constituents. It really was just a dog and pony show to pretend that they are trying to do something that their constituents would appreciate and then thereafter support them. It's game play.
Good point, because Mitt Romney passed a version of Obamacare in the state of Massachusetts, right? And he was a Republican, and
that's right.
There's been precedent where Republicans have supported, versions of Obamacare or similar stuff. So I mean, these guys, both parties are both at best, fascist, and there's a lot worse we can talk about them. We've discussed that on previous shows.
Yeah.
So nominate the mayor of Flint, Michigan, for that. It sounds like it's true. Unfortunately, my thoughts and prayers go out to the people in Flint, Michigan if they don't have their water crisis fixed. Lower the taxes, let the free market fix the solution, maybe temporarily let the water prices go up there, so let there be investment and innovation into the water industry there and the private sector. There is really good water filtration technology out there. Origin Clear is making some amazing water filters, and there's a bunch of other companies out there doing it as well with, nanomembranes and things like that with nanotechnology. But that's getting off on a tangent. My next scumbag nominee, all of Congress, and let me explain why. There's a Zero Hedge story from May 16th, 2016. It's based on a New York Post expose. There's a 65-page manifesto. Eric, I guess it's coming out in a book. It's called The Confessions of Congressman X. And this book will be based on years of transcribed private discussions, which the congressman last November gave editor Robert Atkinson. And he says more time was spent fundraising by people in Congress than reading bills, and calls Washington a quote-unquote sinkhole of leeches, unquote, where money corrupts and House members are puppets to lobbyists who bankroll their campaigns. And then, this Congressman X, who many people are speculating is a Democrat from New York. He's a congressman Democrat from New York. And he admits that he was an enormous hypocrite and that he contradicted himself all the time. And he said, but few people actually noticed it. He said, 1 minute I rail against excessive spending and ballooning debt. The next minute I'm demanding more spending on education, healthcare, unemployment benefits, conservation projects, yada, yada.
Yeah. Having seen a lot of these rascals up front and close and personal, the level of hypocrisy is something that most of them are, I can say, with the people that I've dealt with, pretty decent and powerful Congress people, that they're aware of what's going on, and they all are playing the game consciously. The level of corruption is not something that they're just kind of like bopping along and completely unaware because they're just within the system trying to get along to get along. No, it don't work that way. When you're a freshman congressman and you get introduced into the power structures within the House of Representatives, and you try to work to get onto committees, and you try to build your own network within the system, you are literally told by your mentors within the political party how the rules of the game work, and that if you don't play along with the way the rules are set up, and particularly in the House of Representatives, because they have to run every 2 years for election. Who
do you think is more of a hypocrite, Eric? Since you are from LA originally, so you grew up around Hollywood celebrities. Are Hollywood celebrities larger hypocrites, or Washington politicians larger hypocrites?
Depends on the category of hypocrisy.
It's close. It's close. It's like Leonardo DiCaprio, talking about environmental concerns and flying all over the globe on his private jet.
Right.
Or Al Gore, with all of his mansions burning through electricity and all this stuff. So these guys are just, whether it's Washington politicians or Hollywood actors, these guys are just enormous hypocrites. Did you hear the Jesse Ventura quote, what he said about these guys, the Washington politicians?
No.
He said these guys are exactly like professional wrestlers. He said when the camera's on, right, there's the good guys and the heels, and they each, take turns playing these roles, right?
Yeah.
And they act like they're going to hit each other over the head with a chair and punch each other, right? And then he said as soon as the cameras are off, they're drinking and hanging out with each other, laughing about how they suckered people and tricked people into this act and having a good time with each other, and they're all, buddies.
Yeah, as a former wrestler, he likes making those analogies. I've heard him do things similar to that before. But I know I'm hesitant to drop names and whatnot, but I mean, I've met with some pretty powerful Congress people, and they take my calls when I call them just because I'm a political activist, and I'm, part of the Republican Party myself, more as a Ron Paul style Republican, and I can say with direct personal experience that these people are very cognizant of the corruption, and that they're there in part because they want a piece of it themselves. Yep. They're feathering their own nests, and it's truly disgusting to see.
Yep, and they're trying to get as much as they can before everything collapses and Rome burns. They're trying to increase their net worth by if they're only worth $100,000.
You're giving them more credit than they're worth, because frankly, I don't think most of them have that level of understanding. It's more just in the here and now appreciation of what they can get out of being a congressperson. They're not smart enough to recognize that the system is falling apart the way that it's designed.
Well, I've heard, I don't know if any of them came to the conclusions on their own, Eric, that they realize the system is collapsing, but some of them have been told by, people they respect that the system could collapse soon. And I've heard, some of the Washington politicians from some of my contacts have been buying gold and silver, since 2008. They've been, as insurance.
It's going on, but that's the minority. I would, and I'm just throwing out a number, I would be totally surprised if more than 10% of the body of the Congress was cognizant of how fucked up things are. Frankly, I think most of them are just ignorant. But they're not ignorant about how to actually increase their net worth and feather their own nest and partake in the corruption that is K Street, et cetera. I mean, they're very expert at that.
Yeah, a lot of them don't care when things collapse as long as, they're still making money for their lobbyist firms and things like that, and they're getting, the kickbacks and things like that. They're trying to get rich as quick as possible, and they're not serving their voters for the most part. They're only serving themselves and their lobbyists and their special interest groups and things. But our last group of scumbag nominee, it's the Bernie Sanders supporters from a Mark Dice video. I think Mark Dice does a great job showing people, the man on the street, how, obviously not our listener base, but, the regular people in the United States, the people on the beach just walking around who pay attention to celebrity gossip and sports and stuff like that and don't pay attention to anything else. And, he went and interviewed recently a bunch of Bernie Sanders supporters, and he actually, like a lot of them, were agreeable with Bernie Madoff as their nominee for vice president. So if Bernie Sanders'
first name is Bernie, come on, I mean.
The Bernie ticket. Bernie.
Bernie. Feel the burn. Sometimes after watching about 5-6 of Dice's videos, I'm beginning to wonder if their IQ is lower in San Diego, or they're putting something in the water.
Or they're just taking advantage there of the prescription marijuana, right?
Yeah, that or a little bit of too much sunshine on people, or who knows.
Well, hopefully, there are some people that are honest socialists, and obviously I don't agree with them, but the ones who are socialists, who like Bernie Sanders, and if they are, think that Bernie Madoff would be a good vice presidential candidate, you need to get yourself informed. If you are a Bernie Sanders supporter, you should look up what the Federal Reserve is doing, because it's big government is protecting them, is protecting the Federal Reserve. It is a cartel. And, you cannot have a cartel or a monopoly, Eric, without big government protecting it. In a free market, it just wouldn't be able to be. You have to have government protection, regulatory protection, tax protection, etc., of your monopoly or oligopoly. And that's what we have now in the United States, where, Monsanto, with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the pharmaceutical companies with the FDA. These guys are protected by the government, by the regulatory agencies. So what's the point in having these regulatory agencies then if they're just going to spend most of the time protecting the big corporations then? What system would work then? It's just, I mean, hello?
Yeah. I'm here.
You agree with what I'm saying, or?
In terms of an alternative economic system, I mean, I think that the Austrian school and the voluntary associations in business and more of a libertarian perspective would, in fact, create an economic system with its rhythms that is more organic. Right now, we have a crony capitalist system, and with elements of socialism to kind of act as an escape valve, and we talked about that in the last show as well too. Things are not likely to change until a lot more pain happens, unfortunately, and that kind of fits with our overall theme of our show. I mean, this is a dystopian type of quagmire that we're in, where the economic system is not likely to be able to grow itself out of the problems that we have, the excess debts that we have, the constant ever accumulation of wealth into higher, tighter hands, and the income inequalities that are happening with the Fed in particular driving it. And in the United States, we've seen the middle class see huge damage, and 15 some odd million jobs on a net basis having been evaporated ever since the 2008 crash. So, there's a lot more pain that'll probably happen, and as a result, hopefully, we'll start seeing people begin to ask more serious questions and demand change. Maybe something like that will happen after this next election, but who knows? I mean, there's so much in flux now. It's really hard to tell whether or not we're going to pull ourselves together. America tends to do that, and the American people tend to be good people, but reasonably informed when they have to be. But the problem with the American public is that we are so bogged down with the bread and circuses phenomenon that it's like the Mark Dice videos. People are not tuned in and they're uninformed, and as a consequence, they're getting screwed because we don't have a population that's looking out for itself.
Yep, yeah, Eric, and I think the inflation and taxes that people on Main Street are getting, and obviously Wall Street's talking about deflation. We have all these people talking about deflation. Most of that's going to be asset price deflation, and it's probably only going to be temporary. So the holders of those assets may temporarily have a huge knockdown in their asset prices, but the people on Main Street are not getting really a lot of any type of beneficial deflation at all. Maybe they'll get a cheaper laptop. They had temporarily cheap gas prices here for a little while, although now gas prices are back up, starting to rise again. But the people on Main Street, they're not. Their standard of living has been eroded away for decades because of the Federal Reserve, because the currency itself, these paper fiat currencies, are just being created ad nauseum, massive amounts of them over the decades, really since 1971, and the derivatives market and the dollar was separated from gold. So there's been enormous amounts of inflation and tax increases since then, and we just hear stories. I was talking with Mish. I interviewed him last week or the week before, and he was talking why he's leaving Illinois, and he was paying $15,000 a year in property taxes for not a big house, for like a middle class house. So the property taxes have just kept increasing every year, and his income was not necessarily rising. So we have a lot of people on Main Street who have similar. They're dealing with similar issues with that, where their incomes aren't rising for a bunch of different reasons, mostly due to inflation, and the economy is adapting to new technologies, and people don't need as many human beings on a staff at a lot of companies. So we have a situation where people are going to have to figure out new ways to boost their income to offset inflation and taxes, and it's just you won't hear this being talked about on Wall Street really that often. In the mainstream financial media, they won't talk about how bad inflation and taxes are, and that's the main thing that's in my opinion financially destroying most of the society, besides actually the fact that there's too much debt in society.
America has changed so much now that it actually has become a cultural phenomenon to dress down, to pretend to be poor, because being poor, or the small house movement, HGTV has television shows dedicated to the small house movement. I mean, it's a fascinating thing to watch, because from a cultural perspective, as our society has been forced, and average people have been forced to deal with what's going on, it's actually become somewhat chic to pretend to be poor. And even more wealthy people are, dressing down just because it's supposedly chic to be poor.
If you're a wealthy person also, Eric, it's smarter to hide your money too, because there's so many people now who we haven't had a massive amount of kidnapping of rich people here in the United States, like there is in Latin America or Asia or other countries necessarily. But if the economy does keep getting worse and worse, that's going to happen.
Yeah.
So that's why also you see a lot of rich people. They're going to be hiding their wealth. They're not going to be dressing up as rich and things like that when they go out in public. They're going to try to downplay their wealth. So, they fit in a little bit better and they don't stick out for potential crimes against them, unfortunately.
Crazy days.
Yep. Welcome to Dystopia, guys. Well, this was episode 21. We ended up a little over an hour. Hopefully you guys won't be too angry. Hopefully you enjoyed the quality of this content. If you have anything else you want to include on future shows, put them comments below. And thank you again for your time, guys.